Hello, class. Welcome back to your course on Old Testament prophets or the prophetical books. Today, we are going to talk about Prophet Habakkuk from the 7th century. Let's start the course quickly. Okay, so as you can see before you, I'm sharing the screen. He is the 7th century prophet, and the lesson in your book in the Old Testament prophets is 11, and the prophet is Habakkuk. So let's talk about Habakkuk directly. So, not much is known about the prophet from apart from the two times that his name is mentioned in the book itself. So later he appears again in an apocryphal book, which is not a part of the Bible, as which we have in the book The Bell and the Dragon in chapter 14 of the Greek version of Daniel. He is mentioned as ministering to Daniel in the lion's den, but the information is not reliable and the source also is not reliable, as these are all found in the apocryphal section. Okay, so his name means embrace. Okay, his name means embrace. He lived in the latter part of the 7th century in the southern kingdom between 620 to 610 BC. He was a contemporary of prophets Jeremiah and prophets Nahum. He was probably either a professional prophet in the courts, in the king's court, or a Levite chorister in the temple. That means in the part of the worship, okay, in the worship team, as you can say, the chorister means he's in the worship team in the temple itself, not like the worship team that we have today, but it was a different kind of worship where they used to play guitar, where they used to play stringed instruments and sing psalms and all those things. So he was probably he belonged to a Levite family and probably a chorister in the temple, or he might have been a prophet, a professional prophet in the king's court. Probably he received his oracles during his time of service in the temple. Okay, so when he was serving in the temple, probably it is assumed that he received his call and his oracles at that time. So his closing statement, as you can see, if you read the last verse, the last part of the last verse, chapter 3, verse 19b, you can read over there, for the chief musicians, director of music on my stringed instruments. Okay, this reveals that this book is a psalm. Okay, this book is a song. It's not a prophetic, exactly like prophecy is going on over there, but it is a song. Okay, and the last chapter especially happens to be a song, and it probably was used for liturgical services also. So that is why, as we see that this statement has been written there, as you see in most of the psalms, these kind of sentences are found in the beginning or in the last also. So he was the last of the minor prophets ministering to the southern kingdom before the Babylonian captivity in 605 BC, 605 or 606 BC, just as Micah was the final prophet to the northern kingdom before the Assyrian captivity in the 721 BC. Let's talk about the date of the book. Okay, one historical incident in the book helps us to understand or date the prophecies. That is in chapter 1, verses 5 to 6. Here we see that Yahweh is raising Chaldeans or Babylonians. So that is a historical incident that we can see over here, which helps us to date the prophetical book or the prophecies of Habakkuk. The new Babylonian Empire began in 626 BC with a revolt against Assyria, and so it grew with the conquest of Egypt in 605 BC. So we know that before the Babylonians, we know that Assyrians were ruling, and gradually we see that Babylonians became powerful and they overthrew the power of the Assyrians, and gradually they also conquered or defeated Egypt in 605 BC, which made them a superpower. So they had defeated Assyria, the superpower, and then the other secondary powers, that is Egypt and all, and then they became the superpower or the most powerful ruling kingdom in that area or in that region, that is Mesopotamian region. So the prophecy can be dated between 626 to 605 BC. The book is a series of questions. Okay, so Habakkuk puts a lot of questions before God. So this book is his collection of questions. Now the book is a series of questions and answers from God. It is also called the book of questions and doubt. Okay, so he has a lot of doubts. We'll go through that. He had a lot of doubts and questions, and he puts those questions before God, and that is mentioned in his book. Habakkuk is also called Doubting Thomas of Old Testament by Willington. Okay, he has two main questions that we will deal with also in the main portion of the book. The first question that he raises is, how can God allow the sins of Judah to go unpunished? So there are a lot of sins happening in Judah itself. So he has a question and he's in turmoil that how is God allowing these kind of sins in Judah to happen in Judah without judging? So God answers that Judah will be punished by the Babylonians, which raised the second question. Okay, so okay, Judah is sinning, but how can God? But God answers that God is going to judge them, judge the deeds of Judah by raising Babylonians against them. Okay, so this takes him to the next question. Okay, in the first part itself, uh, could God allow a godless nation to punish Judah, a nation which at least believes in God and has at least few good men? So according to him, Judah had good men. Babylonians did not have good people at all. So the two major divisions of the book are introduced as oracles of the prophet Habakkuk, which alternate between the prophet's prayer and God's answers with occasional words of condemnation, admonitions from Habakkuk. Okay, so we can see that these two questions, he puts before God, and there is question, and then there is an answer from God, and there is an intervention from God, and there is a prayer, and then the second question, and then again there is an answer, and then there is prayer. So this is the format of the book. So as you can see before you, there are oracles. Okay, so there is an oracle, and then a prophet prays and then God answers, and then there is an oracle, then prophet prays and then God answers. So this is a cycle that repeats in the book. The first division contains two such cycles, and the second division concludes the book with one more such cycle and response. Let's look at the division of the book now. Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 1 to 11. First prayer and God's answer. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 12 to chapter 2, verse 5. Second prayer and God's answer. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 6 to 20. Five wars against the Chaldeans. Habakkuk 3, verse 1 to 15. Third prayer and God's answer. Habakkuk 3, verse 16 to 19. The prophet's word of confidence. The message of the book is God is in control of the world and history and will move nations to fulfill his purpose. Okay, so everything is in God's control, though we may think that why this is happening, why that nation is powerful, and what is happening all around me, or why Judah is being judged by Babylonians and Assyrians and all those things, but God is in control and he uses other nations to fulfill his purpose and to fulfill the purpose in history. So Habakkuk's questions are localized, okay, localized, but God's answer is in the larger perspective. So what Habakkuk sees is small, and what God sees is the bigger picture, the larger perspective of the world politics. Habakkuk learns, like Job, to see the larger picture, to see the bigger picture, which he was unable to see earlier. So there are several lessons on prayer we can learn from this book. God does not answer, God does answer prayers, but his answers may not be as we want, and he may surprise us by his answers or even shock us by his answers. Let's enter into the book, the main portions of the book, the passages of the book. Habakkuk will enter the chapter 1 of Habakkuk, verses 1 to 4, and this is categorized as the prayer of Habakkuk. So let's look at chapter 1, verse 1. Firstly, he is called a prophet. Okay, he is called a prophet. A prophet means a mouthpiece for God's message, whom God uses as his mouthpiece to give message to the people. So the prophet was one who is called by God and could see the future, as we have seen in the introductory chapters, using the Hebrew terms that a prophet is a person who is called by God, who could see the future. So he was one of the official prophet attached to the temple in Jerusalem. That is known about him, that he was an official prophet. He used to serve in the temple itself and prophesying over them. Secondly, it says that he has an oracle. It states that he has an oracle. Habakkuk has an oracle. The Hebrew masa, the word masa is translated as oracle, which means a burden. okay, which means a burden and has a literal meaning of something being lifted up or being carried. Okay, something being lifted up or being carried. So that is a meaning that is given for the oracle that he has received. Okay, so this was a commonly used word by the prophets in those days, as the passages that I have mentioned. You can go through that if you want to. Nahum chapter 1 verse 1, Zechariah 9 verses 1 to 2, Malachi chapter 1 verse 1, Isaiah 13 1, 15 1, 17 1, 19 1, 21 1, 11, 13 and 36. Okay, so we see that this word was commonly used. It's called the masa. The word masa was commonly used by most of the prophets, or many of the prophets, on various occasions when they received the message from God to tell to the people. So Jerome comments over here that this word never occurs except when it is evidently grave and full of weight and of labor. Okay, so the message has to be very heavy. Okay, message has to be like a burden. It's very heavy to carry and take it to the people. It would be having very emotionally loaded, or the message so heavy that it's difficult to give to the people, or speak to the people about the message, because it is so deep and so heavy, and it is so it's so heavy, so loaded with the depth of the words of God. Okay, so Jerome states that. So that is why it is oracle, or it is burden. A burden, that as it is mentioned. So Habakkuk's message was really a heavy one to carry, and a heavy one to convey, as it possessed a burdensome dimension from the start. The message that he had, if you can understand, it is the answers of God. So when he was asking those questions and the answers that he received, that was the message that he had to give to the people. So that was burdensome, that was extremely heavy for Habakkuk himself to digest and to take it to the people. So this meant that though Habakkuk did not like the message, but it was from God and had to be delivered to the people. He had no other option. He had no option that he could keep the message to himself. He was given the message from God, though he liked it or not, he had to give it to the people. It was inevitable, which was going to happen, and hence he could not ignore the message and could not stop from warning the people. Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 2, he starts the book with a prayer to God. Okay, so he starts talking to God, conversing with God, and praying to God. He had personal concerns for the society. He was very concerned about the society, about whatever is happening in the society around him in Judah. In his short prayer, he poses a series of questions to God, which he was struggling with, and he has no answers to it. Okay, so he had been questioning, he had been struggling with those questions in his mind, with those doubts in his mind, and it was there in his mind, and probably he was continuously asking God for the answers, but he had no answers for that, and he kept asking God for those questions for answer. Okay, so this the book actually begins within the second verse. When we start with the second verse itself, he starts with that prayer, and he starts with those questions. His prayer is in the form of psalm and lament. Okay, so his complaint is twofold. We see that his complaint is twofold. First, God does not seem to answer his prayer. That is his first complaint, that God does not seem to answer his prayer. Habakkuk says, "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and thou wilt not hear?" So he says, "I've been calling upon you for a long time. You are not hearing. Can you not hear?" He is overwhelmed because of the situation he lived in a terrible time of anarchy and violence, for which he has been praying for a long time but had received no answer from God. So around him there was so much of violence. Around him was so much of there was so much of pressure upon the lower class, upon the poor people, and there was so much violence, and there was so much corruption, and the people were being treated badly. There was injustice. There was social kind of sins, there were political sins, and there were spiritual religious sins, and every kind of corruption was there, and violence was there, which actually terrified Habakkuk, and he could not see all those things happening among the covenantal people. So he is complaining to God, and he is asking for God to intervene, for God to deal with it, and for God to, judge the people of Judah, and for God to, just change the people, change the situation. But God is not answering. So he then says that God does not seem to answer his prayer. He pleaded for deliverance from violence, but God did not listen. So now he is praying for his prayer itself, questioning the capacity of the one to whom the prayer is addressed. How long should I pray when no one seems to listen? So he says that when you are not listening, for how long should I go on and pray? How long should I go on and repeat these same prayers again and again? Should he continue to pray when God does not seem to be interested in taking any kind of action? When God is silent, and when he seems to be not listening, and when he seems not interested in taking any kind of action for the injustice and everything that he is praying for over there, should he continue and pray? Should he continue to pray, or should he just stop and cease to pray? His prayer is thus partly related to apparent ineffectiveness of prayer and partly related to the lack of God's action. So he feels that his prayers are being ineffective, and then he also feels that God is not interested in answering his prayers, or not interested in listening to his prayers. So that is his question and doubt over there. So Job also felt the same. He felt the same. He fell into the same situation in a personal level. So the most poignant cry of Jesus on the cross, if you can see, it was Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. What does it mean? My God, why hast thou forsaken me? This is the same reflection of Job, same reflection of Habakkuk also. Even Jesus cried on the cross, why have you forsaken me, God? Why have you forsaken me, Father? Same thing Habakkuk praying. Can you not hear me, Father? Can you not hear me, God? I am praying for a long time. Job felt the same thing. He felt abandoned by God. In the same way, how often do we feel the same? And when God displays or God delays his answer, like the psalmist's lament, oh Lord, how long? How long? For how long do we have to wait? For how long will you be quiet? How long will you not listen? So many complaints coming in the Bible itself, in like the present times that we see, like Psalms 10 verse 1, verse 13, Psalm 13 verses 1 to 2, 21 verse 1, 35, 17, 42 verse 9, 44, 33, 74 verse 1, and so on. There are so many passages where you can find a similar emotion, a similar complaint for God. The second part, as we can see over here, is God does not seem to control human evil. Okay, so here it means that the prophet's world is marred or just disrupted by the evil and violence and destruction and strife, and he thinks that God has just lost control over it, control over the human evil. Okay, so that's what he's telling over here. He does not specify the problems, but speaks in general terms that there are problems. Okay, so the other prophets like Micah, Isaiah, and Jeremiah give examples of violence against poor, misuse of power by the rich, false business practices by merchants, etc. But Habakkuk does not mention all these things, but he does mention that there is violence, there is corruption, but against whom, against what? He's not mentioning all that because he's so much in pain seeing all these situation, and God knows the situation. That's what he assumes. So the prophet again asks, why? Why do the wicked outnumber the righteous? Why is justice so quickly perverted in the human society? Most importantly, why does God not take any action? So that is his complaint. Why is God silent? Why is he not controlling or curbing the evil in the human society? Why is he just closing his eyes when the righteous are being outnumbered by the wicked? Why he is so quiet and he is so silent and dumb and deaf and just blind to the pervertness of the justice, where the justice is being perverted, where the human society is not getting the justice, and still God is quiet. Why does he not act? That is the question of Habakkuk. Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 3. The next question that Habakkuk asks is, Why is he forced to see injustice in the society when he can do nothing about it? Okay, so when he is there in the society, he feels paralyzed over that. He can do nothing than to pray. Okay, and why is he forced to see all these things when he is not able to do anything to break this chain, or remove the corruption from the society, and remove this helplessness from the society? So this shows his helplessness, and the helplessness of the honest, God fearing people in the corrupt world. So many times we also feel so helpless when we see all kind of atrocities, all kind of corruption, all kind of injustices happening all around us. We only pray and we feel so helpless that we are unable, or we are powerless, we are helpless to do anything, and we fall short of the power to do anything right in that place. In the same situation, we can see Habakkuk stands. The next question he asks is, why does God tolerate wrong? If God does not take action, does it mean that he approves of the evil that man do? Okay, so the next question is, indirectly he's saying that if God is tolerating evil, if God is tolerating the wrong, does it mean that God is approving of the evil that man is doing? Does God approve the evil that man does, or the wrong things that man does? Trying to solve this problem, the liberal theologians in the last century came to a conclusion, and they said, God is dead. There was a book also, God is dead. Does the lack of God's control mean that he is helpless? Is God helpless? Is God dead? No good works through and with humans. No, God works through, okay, through and with humans. Okay, so God is not dead. God works through humans and with humans. He uses them. Okay. After the Twin Tower incident, Billy Graham's daughter was asked, why did God not take any action? To which she replied, she had a very beautiful reply to that. When the religious teaching was banned in American schools, when homosexuality was made legal, when the move to remove "In God We Trust" from the American motto, then then you did not ask, where is God? God is a gentleman. He will not force himself where he is not wanted. So if you only remove him from a place, why is he going to come and force himself back? Habakkuk complains, destruction and violence are before me. This is what even we see today. In Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 4, his problem was acute in terms of special status of his nation. Though the nation had given God, the nation had God given law and divinely instituted system of justice, yet it did not function in the way it should have. It was functioning in an evil way where it should have been functioning in a godly and just manner. The law is paralyzed and justice perverted, that he says. So the law that prevails at present is paralyzed. Okay. Why? Because the wealthy landowners control the courts through bribery. Most of the societies, even today, see this happening. As Habakkuk says, for the wicked surround the righteous, so justice go forth perverted. The problem is not God, but mankind. The problem of sin prevails. Sin perverts justice for its own end. A righteous society can only exist if all, okay, all the individuals follow God and are subject to Him, not one and two, not 50%, not 60%, but all. Habakkuk is not seeking an intellectual solution over here. Mind you, he's not seeking for an intellectual solution to the problems over here, but a return of the law. He wants the law to return. He wants justice to return in the nation where he lives. Okay, he wants that. He does not want intellectual big answers, philosophical answers from God. He wants the justice to come back. He wants the law to be established once again in his life, in the life of the nation. Is it possible? That is the question. Next, we move to chapter 1, verse 5 to 11. Let's look at God's first response to Habakkuk. Chapter 1, verses 5 to 6. To the first question of Habakkuk, why is God not taking action against the violent men in the society? Now God answers. Though the answer may not be as Habakkuk wants, God says, look at the nations and watch and be utterly amazed. So the reply and the happenings in the history are going to startle him. So the events seem to be both startling and unexpected. He adds, "For I am going to do something in your days that you would not believe even if you were told." So, even if I'm going to tell you something that is going to happen in the future in your days, you are not going to believe it. God said he was raising up Chaldeans or Babylonians to do his job in punishing Judea. It was indigestible by Habakkuk. Chaldeans is a more appropriate term as to a group of independent tribal people from the country of Chaldo or Chaldea, situated along the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers between the Persia Gulf and the southmost city of Babylon, a place of swamps, cane breakers, and lakes with a few urban areas. They had risen and taken control of the state in 627 BC, strengthened itself and freed itself from the Assyrian control, thus founding the new Babylonian Empire. So they rose suddenly to power and they strengthened itself. They worked on their military and army and they freed themselves from the Assyrian control and they formed the new Babylonian Empire. It was one of the new superpowers emerging at this stage, which was orchestrated by God. It was not their own effort, but the rising of the kingdom of Babylonia was from God. Nebuchadnezzar, a governor of the sea lands near the Persian Gulf, occupied the throne of Babylonia on 22nd November 626 BC. He made peace with Elam in the coming year, defeated the Assyrians at Salat, and by 623 BC, at there he broke their yoke. Means he just crumbled them down. That's what he did. In 614 BC, the aged king handed his kingdom over to Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, Nebuchadnezzar, we all know, though you might not be knowing Nebuchadnezzar, but Nebuchadnezzar you might be knowing, who conquered Nineveh in 614 BC and Haran in 610 BC and finally defeated Pharaoh Necho of Egypt in the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. And this made them the superpower. This made them the most powerful kingdom in the Mesopotamian region. Thus, Babylon, ruled by Nebuchadnezzar, became the superpower in that region. It was the fast and triumphal conquest. Very fast and very triumphalist conquest. In verse 6, God says, "For behold, I am raising up Chaldeans or Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation who march through the breadth of the earth to seize dwellings not their own." Chapter 1, verses 6 to 11. The complaint of Habakkuk in verse 4 about the erosion of the law and justice in Judah is answered in verse 7. They are dreaded and fearsome. Their justice and dignity go forth from them. Okay, this is what the answer of God is. Very unusual, very beyond the understanding of Habakkuk to what he is asking. So they make their own rules. This God is talking about the Chaldeans or the Babylonians. They make their own rules as they move along. So God answers Habakkuk by saying that a greater lawlessness and injustice will come to them by the hands of a cruel, evil empire as a punishment. So if Habakkuk is saying that Judah is lawless, if Habakkuk is saying Judah is unjust, God is going to bring a greater lawlessness, greater injustice to come, greater cruel people to come, evil people to come and punish Judah. A part of the fear, terror of Babylonian army was, so why the people feared them? Why did the people of other nations were fearful of Babylonians? Because they moved speedily. The pace was very fast. They moved with quick pace, very fast paced. So verse 8 compares their horses and to leopards. Okay, it compares their horses to leopards. Leopards are the fastest animals. Okay, so it is compared. They compare their horses, that means that army, to leopards, the fastest animal on earth. Their army to wolves. Okay, wolves, most cruelest animals, wolves on the prowl. Okay, which describes their speed and ruthlessness. They are also compared to vultures. You know vultures, birds, okay, which sweep down. They come down and capture the weak, pick up the weak animals, and they go. Okay, so they pick up with their toe and they go. All these comparisons show that they were very fast, ruthless, and they lacked mercy and charity completely. Verse 9, they are compared to desert storm. that blows the sand away. So whatever comes in the way of the desert storm, it just blows it away. That's how they do. They swept away everything before them. They respected no other authority but their own as their god. Okay, might as their own god. Okay, so we have to understand that they respected no gods, they respected no authority, but their own might was their god. Okay, so yet God is telling that because of their pride, he's talking now about Babylonians only, because of the pride of the Babylonians and their self-confidence, they also will fall. Okay, that's what God is telling. So now Babylonians are going to overpower or take or topple the kingdom of Judah, because Judah is unjust and Judah is lawless right now, and they have turned away from God. But later on, at a later level, God is going to, because of the pride of Babylon and their self-confidence, self-dependence, and their might and everything, because of which they have become proud, they will also fall. Okay, they will also be judged. Let's see some lessons we learn from God's answer. God does not respond to prophet's prayer. Okay, God firstly does not respond to prophet's prayer. Habakkuk complains that God was not answering his prayer since long, but God says, in his right time. Okay, God speaks in his right time. God may delay, but he will surely answer. That is the thing that we can learn. Second, God is always at work, though his actions may not be always evident. Okay, we might not see his actions, but he's always at work. Habakkuk was concerned about his local society, but God was concerned with the larger world, bigger world. Habakkuk had a limited and insufficient vision, but far away in the Babylonian event we were taking place, which would change the course of history. So, though he did not understand what's happening, but what was going to happen according to God would change the course of history. Habakkuk thought God was doing nothing, but he was working in his own way. Thirdly, God's response to prayer may be totally different to what he expected, okay, or we expect. Habakkuk's immediate problem was his nation, but God was seeing the bigger picture. Therefore, it was difficult for him to accept that the answer lay in the deeds of an alien or a foreign power. So he did not believe that God would use a foreign power, but God is saying that he is going to use a foreign power, and that is his plan. Do we expect God's answer when we pray? God may have his own answers to the problem that may involve us in an unexpected way. Let's move ahead and talk about second argument, Habakkuk's argument and God's response. Chapter 1, verse 12. Verse 5, let's look at verse 5 first, as it was done in the previous section. God had told him, you would not believe if I told. Okay, God told him, you would not believe if I told. And Habakkuk is actually unable to believe what God said. This is subjective listening. Okay, subjective listening. So as humans, we hear what we want to hear. Okay, we hear what we want to hear and we block out what we do not want to hear. Habakkuk is shocked to hear the answer, as it brought a worse scenario than what he was complaining about. So what God was saying was a more worse situation or condition than what he was what Habakkuk was telling God about. The violence around him is going to meet a greater violence. The cure is worse than the illness of their sin. Okay, the solution is worse than the problem, that he says, that as Habakkuk is stating over here. He fails to understand God's nature in his divine response, okay, because it does not match or fit into his theological picture of God. So he fails to understand the nature of God, because he has bracketed, or he has boxed the nature of God, and he feels that this is how I visualize God, and the response of God is completely opposing or opposite to the theological picture that I have about God in mind. So, what does Habakkuk do? Now, Habakkuk describes God in the following ways. He says, God is unchanging and eternal. Chapter 12, sorry, verse 12. He says, my God, which means he's a personal God. This is a personal declaration. Then he talks about God as my Holy One. Verse 12b. Again, it is a personal declaration. Now, his problem is Can a holy God, okay, who is separated from sin, use a wicked nation as his instrument? Fourthly, the way he describes God is Lord. Okay, Lord. Twice he uses it, Lord, in verse 12a and 12c. The Jewish term Yahweh is addressed over here, which they do not utter out of reverence. Okay, but Habakkuk chooses out of his desperation to call on the name of Yahweh twice, which they usually do not utter. Fifth, O rock, verse 12d, on whom he trusts and he depends. Okay, this is the way he describes God. This is the way he understands God. Now, with these fivefold description of God, he makes two statements. So he has this understanding of God, as we have mentioned over here. And now with it, he is going to make two statements. First, we will not die. Okay, we will not die. An assurance that despite of his judgment, God will protect Judea from total destruction. That's what he believes. Probably he's referring to the remnants over here. He trusts God's covenant with Israel and with David, but he tends to forget that the covenant has two sides. Okay, the covenant has two parties, covenant has two sides. God's promise is to take care of them as long as they follow him. So there are two parts. God will take care of them if they follow him. Okay, it has both responsibilities and obligations. The idolatry and unfaithfulness deprive them of their rights to the covenant. Okay, because they have been idolatrous, because they have been unfaithful, they have deprived themselves of the right to the covenant of with God, or to the agreement that they had made with God. Secondly, we can say the second statement, you have appointed them to execute judgment, O rock, and you have ordained them punished. So his plan has to be accepted. Okay, God's plan has to be accepted, though how hard it may be. Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 13 to 17. Now that he has expressed his theological understanding of God, he argues with him with contradictions. Now he says, like this is your nature, this is your character, but what you're saying, your actions are not pursuing that character. Okay, that theological understanding that I have of you, your actions are completely opposite, or they're completely contradicting to that understanding, the theological understanding that I have of you. That's what Habakkuk is doing over here. So he questions God, that how can God, whose very nature and character cannot stand evil or wrongdoing, allow it to flourish unpunished and permit the Babylonians, a more wicked nation, to oppress the chosen people. So God cannot tolerate evil. He is holy. So how can he use a more wicked nation to judge the chosen people? He asks how the wicked can swallow up the more righteous. You should note the words the more righteous. How can wicked swallow up, the more righteous? Now, there is a basic error in the argument. We have to understand that here, which is often seen even today. Even today we talk in these terms. Okay, but we have to understand this is a basic error which is in our understanding. Okay, there is no big sin and there is no little sin, and there is no white lies. All sins are equal. Lie is a lie. White lie, black lie, nothing lie. Okay, lie is a lie, sin is a sin. There is no big sin, there is no little sin. Okay, sin is a sin, big or small. We cannot measure it. Okay, we cannot compare our sins with the others. If we have sinned against God, he has the right to punish and discipline us in whatever way he chooses. We cannot compare two sins. Okay, so but here Habakkuk was saying that how can wicked swallow up more righteous? So he was comparing the degree of sin and wickedness and righteousness. The most common term for sin used in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, is hamartia, which means missing the mark, which means failing to be the people God wants us to be. Okay, failing to be the people God wants us to be. So, the kind of people God wants us to be, we fail in that. And that is how we miss the mark. It talks of sins of omission, which are left out, not sins of commission, which are made to do. Okay, so it talks about sins of omission, not so sins of commission. Now, in verse 14, Habakkuk protests, stating that God has made men like fish. They are helpless to resist the fishermen because they are trapped in the nets. Now they are helpless. They cannot resist the fishermen. His countrymen are helplessly swimming in the nets of the Babylonian Empire, who can destroy them in any instant. Okay, so they are in the nets of the Babylonian Empire, and the Babylonian Empire can just, just uh, destroy them any moment. The worst part of the Babylonians, the worst part we can say that is that the Babylonians rejoice over the catch. The Babylonians are rejoicing over their victory, rejoicing over the big catch of Judah that they had of an innocent as his right and has been done by his might. Okay, we can understand that they are thinking, the Babylonians are thinking that it is by their own might that they have been able to catch Judah, which is not true. And they worship their nets and ignore God. They have undermined, and they don't think that it is God who is actually enabling them, lifting them, and making them powerful to do what they are doing. He ends the metaphor by asking, Is the fisherman too empty? Is the fisherman to empty his nets forever? Okay, will they empty their nets ever? Okay, will it happen? So the Chaldeans have become like wild animal and treat others like wild animals too, and feel their right over them. So these Chaldeans feel that they have the right over these people or these animals or the humankind or this nation. That's what they are doing, and they feel that they are rightfully treating them. Okay, so they feel that this is their right. Their might is forcing them to feel that it is their right to rule over them and treat the other people like this. So the way of Assyrians came upon the northern kingdom, the Babylonians came upon the southern kingdom. Chapter 2, verse 1. Habakkuk here sees himself like a watchman, watching and waiting at the ramparts of the fort. The role of the watchman in Israel was the role of the watchman in Israel was crucial, like in Hosea chapter 9, verse 8. God appoints his prophets to be his watchmen for the people, to warn them of the approaching enemy. So the watchman's duty is to warn the people of the approaching enemy. Six things we should note about the watchman over here. So watching and waiting takes time. Habakkuk wanted God to take action, quick action, but God works in his own time, but he surely does. Watching and waiting makes lonely work. This is the second thing. Watching and waiting makes the work lonely. Okay, makes somebody work in a lonely place. It is a solitary sentry duty. It is an isolated job. Third, watching and waiting offers an alternative option. While we wait and pray, God may show us different kinds of solutions. Okay, that is the different options, different solutions which we can take. Watching and waiting calls for quietness. Okay, so when we watch and wait, we have to be quiet. Sentries have to listen and watch. They need to be alert. Their minds have to be alert to the slightest sound at nights. Habakkuk says, I will look forth to what to see what he will say to me. So he will wait quietly to see what God will say to him. If we do not listen to God in silence, we may miss what he says. Watching and waiting requires perseverance. It is a difficult job. Watching and waiting implies both being open to correction. Okay, watching and waiting means open to correction. Habakkuk says, I will look forth to see what he will say to me, and I will swear answer concerning my complaint. God is not only looking for honesty, but humility, to listen and to learn. God wants teachable people. One should be teachable, open to reproof and correction, as we see in 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16 to 17. James 1:23 to 25 states, we ought to be doers of the word, not only hearers of the word. Habakkuk chapter 2, verses 2 to 4. What is Habakkuk asked to do? Okay, what is he asked to do? There are three reasons for what he has been asked to do. It will take the reasons are, it will take place, so it should be recorded. Okay, he is asked to record things down. Okay, so he is asked to record things down because these things are going to take place. Secondly, it will take time, but wait for it. Okay, whatever he's saying, whatever God is saying, it will take time, but it will happen. So you have to wait for it. So thirdly, it will happen at an appointed time. So it's not a hurry. It will not happen the moment you think, but it has an appointed time, a fixed time, and it will happen at that time. Verse 4 is the most important, though Paul quotes in Romans in regard with the salvation, but here the emphasis is slightly different. The correct translation is not the righteous shall live by faith, but it is the righteous shall live by his faithfulness. So there are two emphases over here in this verse. The faithfulness is the key to righteous living. Faithfulness is faithfulness, not faith. Faithfulness is the key to righteous living. Here, the faithfulness is seen in terms of covenant and integrity of relationship between a person and God. For Habakkuk's faithfulness means to continue to cling to God even though he may not understand. So we have to cling to God even though we may not understand many times his action or timings. A continued relationship with him even in dark times of fear and despair. So even in difficult times, even in dark times, we have to continue to have that relationship with God. Can cling on to him. Second, the righteous and faith are directly related. The righteousness and faith are directly related. A person is not accepted on the basis of the works, but he's justified according to faith in Christ's sacrifice. Okay, so our work is not counted, but our faith is counted. The meaning of our life comes from our commitment to God in faith and in continual faithfulness towards Him. So the meaning of our life actually is based on our commitment to God. Okay, we believe in Him and our commitment to God and our walk with Him. The best known verse in Habakkuk is found in chapter 2, verse 4b. The righteous shall live by their faithfulness, by his faithfulness. It is quoted three different passages in the New Testament with slightly different emphasis. Paul points out in Romans in 1:17, in Galatians 3:11, also in Hebrew 10:38. Here, faithfulness is replaced by faith. Now, faith in New Testament is once and for all act, whereas faithfulness in Old Testament is a continuous act. The author of Hebrews uses this verse with yet another emphasis, which is not which is on the forward-looking character of saving faith. Okay, forward-looking character of the saving faith, not of the past, not that one time, but forward-looking. Okay, so Paul refers to use hope instead in Romans 8:24. Okay, 1 minute. Okay. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 4 to 20. So 5 woes to the wicked. Chapter 2, chapter 2, verse 4 to 6a. Okay, so let's see this. The change in the tone suggests that the conversation is no longer private between Habakkuk and God, but it is public declaration of an oracle of God to people. Okay, it's a public declaration now. Now it's not between God and Habakkuk, it's a public declaration. Though it is addressed against the arrogant men, the king of Babylon, it seems to be a public proclamation at the temple. Okay, so it is against the king of Babylon, but it is a public proclamation in the temple. Verse 4 brings a transition from a general message to a specific voice against Babylonian king. Verse 4 describes him as puffed up man. Okay, and verse 5 describes him as an arrogant man who is intoxicated by his own success. This made Babylon lose sight of reality and greedy for more, because they were so puffed up that they were greedy for more power. Thus, they conquered more and more nations, taking more and more people as captives. They desired to swallow up the whole world. Verse 6 challenges their greed, and it leads to 5 woes as proclaimed against the king of Babylon, but also could be directed towards the wicked oppressors in Habakkuk's own land. God has both compassion on the oppressed and judgment on the oppressor. Let's look at the 5 woes now. Chapter 2, verse 6b. 2, verse 8. The first woe. The Babylonian king is compared to greedy, thieving moneylender who steals from some, cheats some, takes valuable items in exchange of some small loans, exploits the poor, and becomes rich. This was a common practice in Habakkuk's time. Soon the exploited will rise in rebellion. Okay, soon those who are exploited will rise in rebellion against again and destroy the rebellious against the and destroy the exploiter. Okay, who is exploiting them. Similarly, the nations captured by Babylon will rise up against it and overthrow it. It is mentioned in verse 8. Babylonians were called the hammer of the earth. This came true when the Medes and the Persians joined together and rose up in the time of Belshazzar to destroy the Babylonian kingdom. This comes as a warning who lives this kind of malicious lives. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 9 to 11 mentions the second woe. This is a warning against a man who uses the profit of his unjust gains to build up his house in a high and protected place. This is interesting because Babylon was located on the mountain but on a flat plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates. But Nebuchadnezzar built his five-storied high palace with the famous hanging gardens, okay, hanging gardens on the walls, which became one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. This resembled the mountain in a plain, though it was located in a plain, but his palace resembled like a mountain in the plain. The very purpose of the house is protection, but it was thwarted because it was built by the money that was taken the from by the people from exploitation. The stones of the wall and its beams, woodwork, will echo the lament, showing that the seeds of destruction were from within. That means the money that was used, it was from because of due to exploitation, and this itself will crumble the whole structure down. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 12 to 13 talks about the third war. The first war again was against a man, second against his house dynasty, and the third is directed against the city. A city which is built upon iniquity and bloodshed can never survive. Okay? Any city who is built upon the iniquity and bloodshed can never survive. God is not deaf towards the voice of the human blood. Okay, they were attempting to build their worldwide empire rooted in evil, nourished in blood. Such empires await doom and destruction, no matter how successful they seem to be. In contrast, Habakkuk states in verse 14, the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord and the waters as the waters cover the sea. This is a sudden contrast with verse 4. The righteous shall live by their faithfulness, by his faithfulness, which means that God is in control and will ultimately bring his kingdom in place. It is an antithesis of violence and bloodshed and brings the imagery of pastoral peace and kingdom and of the shepherd kings. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9. It talks of the personal knowledge of God that came with Jesus Christ. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 15 to 17 is the fourth woe. Now the focus moves from imperial goals to the abominable practices of drunkenness and drinking orgies. It talks of the drunkenness and sexual immoralities. Instead of all this, they will be offered a drink of destruction from the hand of the Lord. Okay, so that is what we see, that they were drunk by orgies, they were drunk by their power, abominable practices, and now God instead is going to offer them a drink of destruction by with His own hands. Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 18 to 19, the fifth woe. This last woe talks of idolatry. Okay, so as they depended on violence to conquer and rule, similarly they credited all their success to their idols and their gods. Okay, so he asks how peaks of wood or stone can give you guidance if they do not attribute their success to God Almighty. They will be ruined. So they have to credit their success to God, otherwise they will be torn down. Now, though Nebuchadnezzar learned this hard way, his success failed to do so, which led to their eventual destruction. Habakkuk 2:20 it is an imperious call for silence before the great King, the Lord. Habakkuk is assured that God is in control and the whole world is subject to him. Now, Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 1 to 19. Habakkuk's prayer. This is Habakkuk's prayer. This is the last chapter, the last section of the book. The book ends with prayer, which could be called a psalm, as it has a beginning and an end like a psalm. Word Selah is used three times over here. So it may have been a liturgical response to the temple at the time of a national emergency or disaster. Okay, so usually this kind of psalms were used at the time of as a liturgical response at the time of national emergencies and disaster. So the only petition in this psalm is found in verse 2, which is set in a larger context of recollection, verses 3 to 15, and the expression of his confidence in verses 16 to 19. Now, let it can be studied in three sections. So we'll be studying this psalm, or this whole chapter, last chapter of Habakkuk's prayer, in three sections. Okay. First section, Habakkuk chapter 3, verses 1 to 2. It is a prayer which can be divided again into two parts. So the first two sentences express the prophet's conviction of God's work in the world. Okay, his expression of his conviction to God's work in the world. He stands in awe of his deeds. He stands in awe of his deeds. That means Habakkuk is mesmerized. He is just so awed by the work of God. The rest of the verse is threefold: request that the same work be renewed. Okay, he requests that the same work, the awesome work of God, be renewed and revealed in his time, also that God may show forth, do forth these things once again. So, in the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, revive it. In the midst of the years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. Habakkuk expresses his hope that these years of barren hopelessness will be transformed by God's intervention as it was in the past. Thus, he says, renew your work, do it again, make it come alive again. Secondly, he prays, make them known. Make his works known as God's work remain unseen, unappreciated, and unrecognized unless he opens the blind eyes to see. So, till God opens the eyes of the people to see, the work of God remains unseen or unrecognized. Thirdly, he prays, in wrath, remember mercy. The word for wrath used here is never used anywhere for the wrath of God. Here, Habakkuk's whole body is trembling for the fearsome wrath that God is bringing forth. No wonder why he pleads for mercy. The Hebrew word translated over here for mercy is the form which is used for womb, okay, womb, and signifies a warm love of depth. Okay, so the word mercy over here, it talks about a warmth, okay, warmth and love, deep love. Womb, it's like a mother, okay, and is thus a strong contrast to the fearsome wrath. Okay, so he's telling that he wants God to not be angry but merciful, the tenderness of God to be seen even in his anger. So the prophet is convinced that there will be salvation. There will be salvation for Israel in the future as it was in the past. Let's move on to chapter 3, verses 3 to 15. Habakkuk reflects on the past, on how God came and delivered his people from 400 years of slavery in Egypt to take them to the promised land. Okay, so how God just intervened, how God after 400 years came down among his people through Moses and through in different forms and theophanies, and how God, just rescued them and took them out of slavery into the promised land. Now, God the Holy One comes from Sinai to Egypt. Okay, Teman means Southland. Teman, that is mentioned in the verses, is Southland, and Mount Paran is northwest of the Gulf of Aqaba, is linked with the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. So the phrase, his glory covered the heavens and his praise filled the earth shows the awesomeness and the greatness of God. And we can see the previously, as we were seeing, that it was seen at Mount Sinai over there. Okay, so this is how it will be filled. Okay, at that time when God would bring the people out. So he talks of God as a bright light. Okay, he brings plagues and pestilence to Egypt. Verse 6, he is like great colossus who strides over the earth and all creation. Okay, just like a king strides over all the earth and all creation. Verse 7, he talks of earthquake because of his presence. There are earthquakes because of God's presence. The earth trembles in his presence. The ancient enemies, Cushan and Midian, tremble at his presence. Verse 8, was your wrath against the rivers, O Lord? Was your anger against the rivers or your indignation against the sea when you rode on your horses on your chariot of salvation? There are not ecological, these are not ecological questions. Okay, these are not related to earth, these are not ecological questions, but they refer to the Canaanite deities. Okay, and the Asherah who walks on the sea. Okay, Asherah who walks on the sea, and Baal who rides in the clouds. Okay, but God of Israel is greater than them. So that's what he's doing. He's comparing the Lord and his, is his glory and his majesty and his presence. The nations just tremble before him. And he's talking about, he's saying that though the Asherah is said that he walks on the sea, and the Baal who rides on the clouds, but God is greater. God is great. He divided the sea. He parted the sea. He just divided. He just broke everything. He just divided the sea, and God just walks his chariot. It's like he comes on the clouds. Okay, so that's what he's saying, that he is greater than these gods of Babylon. Here he shifts from God. Okay, the word God, Eloha, in verse from the which was mentioned in verse 3. Now he mentions the term Yahweh, okay, Lord, in verse 8, which shows that he recognizes the holy, eternal, sovereign God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of their fathers who worked with Moses and Joshua being in control. So he's talking about that God. He's talking about that character of God. He uses that name, Yahweh. Okay, he's talking about Lord, not Elohim or Eloha. He's talking about Yahweh, who, who was the God who revealed himself to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moses, and who worked through them, and who is in control of everything in relation to the earth. He's in control with everything. He recalls how God delivered Israel and destroyed their enemies, Ammon and Moab. Now let's move in the last portion, chapter 3, verses 16 to 19. God's previous works give confidence to the prophet. So he remembers all the things that God has done in the past. So he remembers all that, and that gives him confidence to the prophet's problem. So he says in verse 16, yet I will quietly wait for the day of trouble to come upon his people who invade us. So he is going to wait quietly and patiently for the day of judgment. He has brought his request before him, and he has been brought face to face with the Lord, the majesty and his power, and has been profoundly challenged and changed, and this has resulted in joy. So he has brought his complaints before God, he's brought his requests before God, but God has, he has confronted God, he has come face to face with God and his power and his majesty and his profound, and God has challenged him and changed him. And the result is now he trusts in God, and there is joy. First, he will wait patiently for God to act. Okay, he will wait patiently for God to act, which requires a lot of strength and complete trust in God. Though, yes, God says that there will be judgment, but still he waits for that judgment positively. Okay, though the situation is going to be negative, he waits positively for that situation to come. Then he says, he will rejoice in difficult circumstances. Okay, he will rejoice in difficult circumstances of agriculture and pastoral disaster. So, whatever may happen, agriculturally, whatever may happen, the circumstances may be the difficult, the adversity circumstances may be, he is going to trust God. He sees God as his strength and one who enables him to go to greater heights. It is the vision of God, and that God and has helped the prophet to overcome the circumstances and lift his voice of praise. So now, whatever was there in his mind, the turmoil that was in his mind, now he is able to overcome. So the vision of God has enabled him to overcome these circumstances and lifted his spirit so that he can praise God. Craig rightly says, where there is no vision, people perish. But Habakkuk affirms that where there is vision, the people flourish. Okay, so we need the vision of God to flourish. If we do not have any vision from God, we do not have any vision, we are going to perish. Thank you, class, for being there for the lecture. And this is all for the lecture of Habakkuk. We'll meet again with the next prophet. God bless you.